Hello and welcome to our first session. My name is John Ravenscroft and I'm a Professor of Childhood Visual Impairment at the University of Edinburgh. And with me today for our very first session is Emeritus Professor Gordon Dutton, or Gordon Dutton as I shall call him, or Gordon as we go through the talk. And really, as I say, this is our first one and we're trying to do this together without any edits. So if there are errors, we go back a bit or we make some changes, please forgive us. This is entirely our first time. We're trying to disseminate some useful information. So just forgive us our opportunity here. So first of all, welcome, Gordon. Thank you very much. We're a beautiful sunny day today. And would you just like to give a quick, brief introduction of yourself?
Fine. So yes, you've heard my name. I trained as an ophthalmologist and as a general ophthalmologist initially, and then gradually came to specialize in pediatric ophthalmology, and within that ran clinics in how to help children with neurological disorders. And the commonest one we came across was visual impairment due to injury to the brain, or cerebral visual impairment. And so for half a day a week for much of my career, I spent wonderful time, a fascinating time, helping young people who had these disorders. And we worked together internationally with lots of other groups of people to try to come to understand the nature of this condition, which has become now by far the commonest cause of visual impairment in young children throughout the world, including, it seems, developing countries, because I'm working closely at the moment with people in Africa and India, and they are finding exactly the same thing.
Right, interesting. I obviously, you're based near Glasgow and I'm based near Edinburgh, and I've heard you talk several times, Gordon, and you describe the world of cerebral vision impairment due to damage to various parts of the brain as seeing the world inside rather than outside. I'm not too sure what you mean by that. Could you help me with that, Gordon, and explain what that really means?
Well, yes, it's a rather difficult, counterintuitive idea. It's an idea which doesn't really seem to make sense to begin with, because of course, as you're looking at me, you are seeing a picture of a bloke talking with a bookcase behind him. And so the idea that the picture is actually inside our minds rather than out in front of us to begin with is a little difficult to understand. But how can it be out in front of us? Because where is that picture? It has to be created. And just as a camera and then a video creates a picture for a television, that picture is created by a very complex process. And of course, engineers have actually emulated what our minds do. They have created a system similar to the way we see. They've used light. We might say that's obvious, they've used light. But bumblebees see in ultraviolet light. And we see in that bit of the electromagnetic spectrum of radiation with radio waves and other forms of radiation, which happens to be what we call light. So light is actually defined by our biology. So we have this amazing system in our eyes in which there are 1.2 million receptors inside each eye, or about that, if not more, each one being just like a little pixel, like a dot on the screen you're looking at the moment, as it brings this signal of light to focus in the eye with the lens at the front to the back, and then it passes that image as an electrical signal into the back of the brain, the occipital lobes at the back. And at that back area is where the picture is processed very quickly in terms of its color in one area, and then in terms of its clarity nearby, in terms of its contrast, which is able to tell the difference between shades of grey, and in terms of its area over which you can see. So we have colour, contrast and clarity, and area, and then a bit further forwards, movement as well. It's processed because, of course, the image is moving all the time. As you move, the image of what we see is moving as well in respect to ourselves. So in essence then, the picture that is being created is broken down into its parts, and then it goes to two separate, distinct parts of the brain. Just behind your ears, there is the place where we have the library. So it's in this area here called the temporal lobes. And the library contains the images of everything you've ever seen, starting from your first days of life, right the way through your life. This library has been progressively built up so that you can see and begin to come to understand everything that you are seeing. And that's why children have to play.
Can I just interrupt for a second there? It's just, I'm fascinated by the library store here of everything that is being seen. Can that also include, and I actually don't know this, can this include things that I've never seen? So for example, I've never seen a green unicorn, but I can, you know, I can have a green unicorn. Would that be there?
Oh, yes.
That would be somewhere else.
Well, the green unicorn was the instant construct that you and the whole audience and I have made as we have endowed the white unicorn of our history of imagery, which you'll note very carefully that this is linked to language and how important language has suddenly been. And that white unicorn, we've just painted it green because we can use this amazing visual imagination where we can draw upon all of our previous imagery to create whatever imagery we wish to conceive of, which is a miracle in its own right.
And drawing from that that library of resources is there in that temporal lobe then?
Oh, yes, through into the memory. It's a large memory bank, really, in which there's a whole myriad memory banks filed in a remarkable way.
Gosh, it's fascinating, and so so I interrupted you there. So we've got the images that come from the occipital lobe at the back, and it's split up. And part of it you were describing, it goes through into the temporal lobe, where it's all stored from our library of things that we have seen. What else happens to that image?
Well, that image is a free-floating image. It's the image of dreams. It's the image of imagination. It doesn't have a location. It has to be placed. And so we have a separate system, which is where the top of my fingers are. So if I put my hands over my ears, that's okay, overlying the library. And if I put my fingers are going over the top, that is the area at the back called the parietal lobes, and it's at the back, so it's the posterior parietal lobes. In that area is where we now have come to realize that a three-dimensional mapping takes place, which is mapped with respect to our bodies so that we can move freely through the visual world through the map that it has created. But we do that, and that's the difficult bit to understand, we do that by creating it without any knowledge. We do it unconsciously. Just imagine yourself now running up a flight of stairs. Your feet moved up those stairs, but you didn't think, oh, there is a step, there is a step. It just happened.
That must be fast. That must be a fast processing system.
Indeed, it is. Imagine running down a mountainside in which the ground is irregular, with pre-placement of your foot accurately orientated to exactly the shape of the rocks that you're jumping over.
So so let me get this right. So as I move, for those who don't know where I live in the countryside, and I'm looking out into my garden, and if I move around that garden, uh, uh, digging or placing things around it, I'm very quickly having to move my body, and all that's happening there at that time at a very fast unconscious process.
Yes.
Gosh, wow. And how does that then link into what you were describing in the temporal lobe? How is that networked up?
Well, there are, within the brain, there are lots of bundles of fibers, and they are myriad. There are loads and loads of them. But we have simplified it down to fibers that go from the back up to the top, which functionally is called the dorsal stream. Strangely, it's called dorsal because the top of the head in anatomy is when the head is placed right back. Therefore it becomes at the back, dorsal back. And ventral means chest, the front stream, which is actually here, but as the head goes back, it's at the front. And so those were called, they were first found, and they are the functional streams. And now more recently, it's been discovered that these are actually real bundles of fibers, fine, like silk threads, each thread belonging to a nerve, each nerve connecting with millions of other nerves, but these bundles that pass through. And so the dorsal stream is called the superior at the top, longitudinal because it goes front to back, fasciculus, which I think is a bit of a misnomer because a fascicle is a bundle and a fasciculus is a little bundle, but actually it's quite a big one. And then there's another bundle called the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, which actually is the ventral stream. So one is anatomical, the fasciculi, which is plural. It's not fasciculuses, it's fasciculi. So these bundles are bundles of fibers, and but in which it's an anatomy is the inferior longitudinal fasciculus and the superior longitudinal fasciculus, whereas the should we call it the functional bundles are named the ventral and dorsal streams. And then of course there are connecting bundles between the two, which have yet to be further elucidated, but they're clearly present. And of course they cross, there's ones that cross over the top. So from left to right and right to left as well.
Gosh, it's very, just vision is just hugely complex, hugely complex. So we've talked a little bit about if everything works fine, right? So if everything works well, we've got this connection between the dorsal and the ventral stream, and it enables me to call upon my visual memory to able to do things. It enables me to drive, to walk around, to move my arms, to move my body through the 3D world. So do you want to help me a little bit then, Gordon? What happens if things go wrong, right? What happens if we start to get damage?
Can I just put in one little further bit of information here before I answer your question? The first is that the front of the brain is the thinking brain. And that is the part which, it's a part which enables you to make decisions. So you said, if I go gardening or if I walk around my garden, those are all decisions made by the frontal brain. So the picture of vision has to be completed by the fact that it's all being passed to the front, where we actually use this information to enable us to do things. But then, yes, you asked the question, where does it go wrong? Well, the key thing to recognize is that just like any other structure of the body, the brain, as an anatomical structure, can have things that go wrong with it. And there's a whole list of them. I used to teach a list to, and I still do it, teach a list of causes. It can be an injury, trauma. It can be due to lack of oxygen or blood supply. It can be due to lack of sugar. All of these can happen at any time of life, right the way from before birth at birth, after birth, and through into the elderly who may have a stroke, which is lack of blood supply and oxygen supply, or bleeding into the brain, which in turn makes that part not work. And when we recognize that 40% of the whole brain is devoted to vision, then you might expect that in a large proportion of people with stroke, their vision is affected, and indeed it is. So it's any form of injury can affect vision if these anatomical structures, which I've outlined to you, are affected by one of these many processes.
And like you say, again, it can happen at any time. So like you say, before birth, just after, or strokes. Yes. Wow. Okay. And that might explain why we do have many people who have strokes might then have their vision affected. Is because if 40%, like you say, of the brain is involved in processing vision, then it's likely, really, isn't it, that this is going to happen?
Yes.
So one of your other talks I've listened to, Gordon, is really talking about the variability of vision of children, particularly children that I'm interested in with CVI, and how their vision changes. It's not like changes. As I get tired, I feel I need to put my glasses on, and then my vision's obviously corrected. But I'm interested in how children's vision, or children with CVI, and how their vision changes when more and more things are brought into the visual world, are brought into, I guess, from your earlier explanation, are brought into the inside mind there. So,
Yes.
so tell me, why does that happen? Why does a child's vision get more limited, I guess, when there are things brought in? I mean,
well, let me do an experiment.
Okay.
I'm going to just walk around my room for a moment. So I obviously have to watch where I'm going. But what I'm doing is I'm first of all going to show me against a different scene. I know the lighting is changing, etc. But I want the audience to be able to see me. Whoops, I'm losing my balance there. Against a scene in which, if I go closer, there we are. I'm fairly easy to see and against a blank wall.
Yes,
And
yeah, very clear.
as I walk round through into where the bookcase was, because neither of us are really against a very good background, here, there we are, I do that, your brain is having to process a lot more information. So for a start, that's why museums have gradually over the years simplified their displays, so there's much less to see. So in fact, for all of us, it's universal that the more visual information there is to see, the less easy it is to access and find things within clutter. So hence the needle in the haystack analogy. A needle on a bare floor, you can find instantly, especially if the sun's shining on it. But a needle in a haystack is impossible to find. And that is exactly what we're talking about. That process of extracting a singularity and something of importance or salience from the background that you're looking for is difficult for everybody when there's a complex background. So the mapping center, as I've already outlined, is at the top in the posterior parietal area. And that mapping is done by how much information we can handle. So if there is an injury to these bundles, so there are fewer fibers in these bundles, then there are fewer pixels on the screen of our vision. And so for a start, that could decrease the clarity.
Okay.
But in addition, if there's fewer pixels, these little dots on the screen, then that can also mean that there is less capacity to handle information, visual imagery. And so the more clutter there is, the more a brain that has less capacity to handle lots of stuff, the more it becomes less able to cope and to see. So this doesn't deal with the variability yet. It just says there's a problem with clutter. But of course, let's just draw an analogy to doing something which we can't do at the moment because of the current situation, which is the COVID-19 outbreak, in case this is being viewed in the future and people are wondering what I'm talking about. At the present, there's no flights. And so if you wanted now to get onto an aeroplane, you would get straight through security. But when there's lots of security channels that are needed for a large queue, we can all get through. But if some of them people have gone off sick and there's only one security channel, it takes ages. And so the people go through security into the mind of the airport. The visual data goes through these multiple channels in parallel next to each other. They are processed together, they are parallel processed into the airport. Cut down that parallel processing and you see less. Now, let's just think about that. We've now understood, I hope, that the more there is to see, or the more there is to think about, or the more there is to discomfort or pain, we all find that we get distracted and can't do things so well. So what if you've got fewer channels, less parallel processing? Of course, it gets overloaded. And when it gets overloaded, it takes a much, much longer. And so that explains, going straight back to the needle in the haystack, why you can find the needle on a bare floor, but you can't find a needle in a haystack. And so the needle in the haystack problem becomes far, far worse, or far, far greater, should I say, when there is a situation in which there's a lot of mental clutter to handle, a lot of information to handle.
And so does that information, if you reduce then the clutter, the visual scene that you're observing, and that's coming into the airport security system, can that, if you do reduce that, is that possible then to increase, I guess, vision, the processes that's going on? You'll be able to use more of the brain that's involved in that because you're able to process that. So what I'm trying to get at, Gordon, is should we aim to reduce that visual clutter?
Oh, absolutely. And it's this idea of clutter which is besetting schools throughout the country. The idea that for all schools, the decoration that's hanging on all the walls for all the children. Remember that there's a huge spectrum of children in every class, and having no clutter enables everyone to learn better. It's universal. And the idea that all the children's work should be distributed over the walls is simply, it's a great idea, but it's very odd that it's all displayed at adult eye level and not child eye level. I wonder why. Well, the key thing is that if you want children to learn, then a bare classroom gets much higher learning, and there's good literature on that now. So that's a universal thing, but then of course, for the group of children that have got a degree of impaired visual processing, then of course they suddenly become unable to function well in an environment when they move into one that's full of clutter. They can't do it. And so what we're doing is, just like we have now to provide a lift for somebody with a wheelchair, and don't expect them to take their wheelchair downstairs, we should declutter classrooms, because in order that all children who've got any problem with vision, because this all applies also to low vision, ordinary low vision too, they can't cope in high clutter, that clutter needs to be decreased. And the school inspection system that we currently have, which insists upon cluttering the walls, is fundamentally incorrect.
So, good. Thanks for that. I have talked about it when I'm giving my own classes, of course, and I show examples of classrooms. When you walk in, there's like a shopping line, and there are all these paintings on the shopping line, on the washing line, not shopping line.
Yes.
On the washing line, they're all. It's just like I can only spend 5 minutes. Speaking of shopping, actually, as I accidentally was, of course, this might understand why. There may be a lot of children have behavioral issues when you walk into a supermarket, if you can nowadays walk into supermarkets. The amount of visual information that is in supermarkets is huge. Would that be part of an explanation?
Yes, it is, because there's very little, if any, research currently on how much clutter children of different ages can cope with. But having been a dad myself of 3 children, it's absolutely clear that as soon as you take your children on a walk through the woods where they become very upset because it's all cluttered with trees and woods and things, and then up into the open landscape, they suddenly rush out into the open landscape and have a wonderful time because the clutter's been removed as 2, 3 and 4-year-olds. And it gets better as you get older. So it's quite clear that the amount we can handle gets better. And of course, that explains why books for little children have empirically, quite correctly, much, much less visual information than books for older children. So there is this, so children that are suddenly exposed to the supermarket are suddenly exposed to overwhelming amounts of information and can become upset, not surprisingly.
And I guess for parents, and if you are a parent of a child with cerebral visual impairment or visual processing difficulties, think then you would advise. I'm asking. Think then about how you can maybe declutter the home environment and not have patterned carpets, not have a lot of visual stimuli. Would that be right then?
Yes, absolutely right. And I think I've learned this primarily from parents themselves. Over the years, as we were finding more and more cases, it was a huge privilege to see so many children whose parents were able to let me know what had helped their children. And so what effectively I became was a person that just conveyed the information from one set of parents to the next. And the stories I heard were universal, that when clutter is gradually diminished, not too much to cause upset, but progressively diminished, the amount of calm that produces and the amount of spare RAM in the computer of the mind to process other things that creates is phenomenal. So just decluttering can make an enormous difference to all children. And therefore, when you might say, but we have children as well who have not got cerebral visual impairment. Well, yes, it helps them too. So no harm comes whatsoever from decluttering. It also helps the parents as well.
Yeah.
Makes everybody calmer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. All right, Gordon. So, we've just scratched upon the surface, and I'm sure over the next few months I'm going to ask you back again. But is there anything you would like to end on? Is there any? I'm going to, at the end of this, point to some resources, particularly the CVI Scotland website, where you yourself deliver a whole series of more in-depth explanations than we can in this 30-minute chat. But is there anything you would like to particularly end on that you would like to say?
I think the key thing to recognize is the difference between medicine and education. In medicine, we actually seek out abnormality. We seek out disorder and disease. And we effectively, I think wrongly, label cerebral visual impairments as a medical disorder. But actually, for all conditions for which there is no medical treatment, the medical process stops at the point of diagnosis. And it's that point that I myself, in my practice, changed to become a habilitationist, if you like, somebody to help people. And it stops and should stop by actually saying that everybody is normal. Normal is me. Well, those people watching me will think, that's not normal. It's odd to be giving a talk like this off the top of the head. It's unusual. But so every individual is normal in my estimation. They may not be typical, because typical is being the same as the herd. So I think that's that closing message then. Every child is normal unto themselves, and we should not be labeling them medically as disordered or diseased or anything like that. They need to be loved, accepted, appreciated, and included within our worlds as the wonderful, normal people they all are.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you so much more. Professor Gordon Dutton, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your wisdom. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.